Hey everyone, it's me again with my creepy voice straight from the depths of hell. Let's keep the ghost story series from Threads going. And trust me, these stories hit a lot harder if you listen around midnight. Story number 1. One of my closest friends died in a traffic accident. I stayed at her house from the moment they brought her body home until they placed her in the coffin. I cried, talked to her about everything, and when I finally left, I completely forgot to do the ritual where you're supposed to burn paper offerings and step back and forth before entering your house. Late that night, I was asleep when I suddenly woke up because I had to teach at 5:15 the next morning. I grabbed my phone to check the time. It said 3:05, so I closed my eyes and tried to go back to sleep. Then, out of nowhere, I opened my eyes again and saw the shadow of a woman standing at the foot of my bed. She was wearing white, with long hair hanging down. I was absolutely terrified. My friend was Christian, so when she passed away, her family dressed her in white for the funeral. That's when I completely panicked. I shut my eyes, but then I got hit with sleep paralysis. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. It felt like someone was pressing down on top of me. I started quietly chanting Buddhist prayers, and after a while the pressure eased. Once I felt a little better, I forced myself back to sleep. The next morning I told my mom and everyone around me what had happened. They all said it was probably my friend coming back to see me one last time. We'd been best friends for 5 years. Story number 2. This one happened to my dad. He served in the military, and his base was located near a military cemetery, so there were many fallen soldiers buried there. Some of their remains had never even been identified. One night, my dad was on duty. He usually worked late and didn't go to bed until around 11 p.m. At about 10 that night, he heard someone knocking on the door. Thinking it was just a visitor, he got up and opened it like normal, but there was no one there. His room was on the second floor, and that night he was the only person in the building. The room was also quite far from the staircase. After opening the door and finding nobody there, he already had a pretty good idea of what was happening. Still, he didn't say anything. He simply closed the door and went back to work. About 5 minutes later, the knocking came again. He got up, opened the door once more, and again no one was there. At that point, he knew exactly what it was, so he didn't react. This time he left the door wide open and went back to his desk. Exactly 5 minutes later, he saw a very tall figure. The man was wearing an old military uniform that was badly torn, worn out, full of holes, and marked with bullet damage. My dad stood up and respectfully saluted him. The figure returned the salute, then took off his military helmet and held it in front of his stomach with both hands. He politely said, "Sir, could you offer us some food? My brothers and I have been so hungry. We don't want to cause any trouble. We're only asking for something to eat. You can make the offering here at the base, and we'll come collect it and share it among ourselves. Please, sir." My dad was stunned, but he nodded and replied, "You all get some rest. Tomorrow I'll ask the men at the base to buy food and prepare offerings for you." The soldier thanked him and then slowly disappeared. It's not the scariest story, but to me it's one of the most touching. My dad said he recognized the uniform immediately and knew the spirit was one of their own soldiers, so he wasn't afraid. Ever since then, every year, his unit has continued to prepare food and clothing offerings for the fallen soldiers. Story number 3. This happened during my military training course. It was my very first day there, and honestly, who could sleep well in a completely unfamiliar place? Before arriving, I'd already heard all kinds of creepy urban legends about the camp, so I was already on edge. Around 3 in the morning, I suddenly heard someone crying. Instinctively, I sat straight up and looked toward the door. I was still half asleep, but I clearly saw a shadow dart passed. At first I was still so sleepy that I just lay back down. Then, a few seconds later, my brain finally caught up. I thought, what the hell? I had just heard someone crying, and I had actually seen something run past my door. I couldn't stop thinking about it, and I was scared out of my mind. I stayed awake the entire night, constantly chanting Namo Amitabha Buddha under my breath, praying for the spirits and my ancestors to protect me. I kept saying, "It's my first day here. If I've done anything disrespectful, please forgive me." I repeated those prayers until the alarm went off at 5 a.m. Honestly, I was so terrified I didn't even want to open my eyes, let alone look at my phone. The next morning, I asked everyone in my room if they'd heard crying or seen anything strange during the night. They all looked at me like I was crazy. They said they slept great and didn't notice a thing. At that point, I figured I was just way too sensitive to this kind of stuff. I was even thinking about asking the instructor for permission to stay off campus because I was so scared. I seriously didn't think I could stay there another night. Then, while we were having breakfast, I found out the truth. One of my friends had been on overnight duty and thought it'd be hilarious to play creepy ghost sounds and run around scaring people. I wanted to strangle him. Story number 4. I used to work at a daycare, and honestly, that place had a reputation for being haunted. The other teachers and I all experienced strange things there in different ways. Here's one story. My classroom was on the 3rd floor, right beside another teacher's room. The balcony had been enclosed and turned into a small office with a desk and chairs, and there was even a sign on the door that said, "Department Head's Office." The thing was, nobody ever used it. So we ended up storing extra toys there. One afternoon we were eating lunch outside the room when we clearly heard someone clicking a pen, typing on a keyboard, and rolling an office chair across the floor. It sounded exactly like someone was inside working. We finally worked up the courage to open the door, and the moment we did, everything went silent. As soon as we closed it again, the sounds started right back up. That same day, we played a prank on one of our assistants by hiding her mattress and blanket in that room. She pretended to be upset and joked that she'd sleep in there by herself instead of joining us in the classroom. Even though she eventually moved her bedding back before lying down, she still experienced sleep paralysis during her nap. She later told us that a man's face appeared inches from hers and screamed, "Get out of my spot!" After that, she absolutely refused to go back into that room. At the time, I didn't understand why one of the children seemed terrified of that office because the child had special needs and couldn't explain it. Then one day, an older child joined the class. The very first time we brought the child into that room, the kid pointed to one corner and said, "What's that black thing over there?" Then the child burst into tears and ran out. I've got plenty more creepy stories. Story number 5. Last year, my older brother got sick and became really weak, so my mom took him to stay with some relatives in the countryside. Every morning she normally went outside with him to play badminton, but one day she was busy cooking and asked him to wait. When she finally came outside, he was gone. Everyone searched everywhere but couldn't find him. A little while later, he suddenly walked back into the yard. My mom asked where he'd been. He said an old soldier had met him at the front gate and led him toward a rubber tree plantation, telling him that soldiers used to be stationed there years ago. Then, out of nowhere, he heard the voice of a woman named Van saying, "Don't go any farther, go back to your mom." That snapped him out of it, and he turned around and came home. The strange part was that Aunt Van had been one of his childhood neighbors, and she'd passed away years before. This all happened during the 7th lunar month, the period many people believe spirits roam the earth. Story number 6. This happened while I was in Thailand. The bathroom had a mirror directly in front of the shower, so you could always see your reflection. While I bent over to wash my hair, I suddenly heard 3 slow, steady knocks coming from the mirror. At first I thought maybe the shower hose had bumped against the wall, but the knocking kept repeating. The bathroom was dimly lit with warm yellow lights, which only made everything feel creepier, so I quickly finished up and got out. It was around 10 p.m. when I was done. My aunt had already gone to bed, so all the lights were off except for the air conditioner and my bedside lamp. I was lying there watching YouTube reviews until almost 1 a.m., when, all of a sudden, someone switched off the circuit breaker. The breaker was beside the front door, so there was no way I'd accidentally hit it myself. What confused me even more was that my bedside lamp stayed on. I was scared, but I kept watching videos to distract myself. After a while, the room suddenly became freezing cold. Even though Thailand was in the middle of a hot season, I couldn't shake the feeling that something on the wall was staring at me. I pulled the blanket over my head and forced myself to sleep. When I woke up the next morning, the curtains were wide open. I tried to convince myself I'd simply forgotten to close them, and maybe the breaker had tripped because of a power issue or someone upstairs dropping something heavy. But when I asked around, I found out only my room had lost power. We checked the breaker, and it had been switched completely off. The weird part was that it was extremely stiff. You had to use real force to flip it. Then something else happened. I traveled to Nha Trang to take an aptitude exam. Around 11 p.m., I went to bed. Just before midnight, I felt someone pat me on the head. It wasn't the sensation of dreaming. It genuinely felt like someone had reached out and touched me. I slowly opened my eyes and saw a woman in a red dress standing beside my bed. I glanced over at my mom, and she was fast asleep. Still half awake, I looked at the woman for another moment. She just stood there silently. Somehow, I ended up drifting back to sleep. Story number 7. A long time ago, I was lying in my rented room one night when I accidentally snapped a random photo with my phone. I opened it just to delete it, but the second I looked at it, my heart dropped. The picture showed what looked like the shadow of a woman with long black hair covering her face. She was blurry and distorted, almost like someone had rushed across the frame while the camera was shaking. I sent the photo to my ex, and after seeing it, she told me she was never coming over to my place again. I ended up deleting it too because something about it just felt wrong. I didn't want to keep that picture on my phone. I don't have it anymore, but I'll draw a sketch of what I saw. Story number 8. When I was a kid, my parents had me sleep in my own room, but I was always terrified of ghosts. I'd often wake up around 2 or 3 in the morning and call out, "Mom!" so she could hear me from downstairs and come sleep beside me. One night I called for her 3 or 4 times, but before she came upstairs I heard another voice coming from the balcony outside my room. It copied me. I called, "Mom?" And the voice answered, "Mom, too?" It wasn't at exactly the same time. It always came a split second later, and the voice sounded strangely similar to mine. Eventually my mom came upstairs, and once I stopped calling out, the voice disappeared. It was the same room where my older sister used to study. The window was large and faced straight out from her desk on the second floor. One night, while she was studying, she looked up and saw a little boy standing outside the window, staring directly at her. At first she thought it was Tung, the neighbor's kid, because our balconies were close enough that someone could climb across. She asked, "Tung, is that you?" The little boy didn't answer. He just kept staring at her without moving. My sister got so frightened that she slammed the window shut. The next day she asked Tung about it, and he told her he'd been asleep all night. Story number 9. I was working at a Chinese restaurant as a food runner. That afternoon I'd taken dipping sauces up to the VIP dining area, but nobody ended up using the room all day. Around 9 p.m., I went back upstairs to clear everything away. The lights were off. And combined with the eerie atmosphere, the place felt absolutely terrifying. Story number 10. This happened one night after I got home from work at around 11 p.m. I closed the front gate and snapped the padlock shut. When I let go, the lock naturally swung back and forth from the momentum. Normally it would sway for 2 or 3 seconds before stopping. But that night it kept swinging much faster and much harder than usual. I'd already turned around and was about to walk inside when I realized I could still hear the lock rattling behind me. A chill ran down my spine. I turned back and stared at it. I watched for about 5 seconds, and it was still moving. Finally I shouted, "Are you going to leave or not?" The instant I yelled, the lock stopped dead. I was trying to act brave, but honestly every hair on my body was standing on end. As I walked into the house, I kept muttering to myself, "This is my house. This is my land. Get out of here, or I'll call on my ancestors to deal with you." I was absolutely terrified. All right, that's all for today. If you enjoyed these stories, don't forget to hit that like button. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.